So a girl once told me that the most noticeably appealing muscle group on a guy were their forearms. And at first, I was pretty surprised, but the more I thought about it, it actually made sense because normal guys usually don't really walk around with their nipples half out. Most of the time they're rocking a t-shirt, short sleeve, and really the only muscle group that's exposed are their forearms. But forearm training is a really controversial topic ripe with misconceptions, which is why in this video I'm gonna show y'all 3 science-based tips that will change how you train your forearms so you can avoid wasting time and grow your forearms efficiently. Also, I wanted to put on your radar that the Attain Seamless Tee by Able has now restocked. Finally, I know they're out of stock for a while, but it was for a good reason because the Attain Seamless Tee is honestly probably my favorite workout t-shirt that I've tried. On top of that, there is a new drop. I'm putting some on screen right now and you can use code PATH for an extra 10% off. So check that out. Let's get back into the video. Now, tip number 1 is training your grip is not the best way to grow your forearms, which basically means doing heavy barbell holds, farmer carries, or even training with those hand grippers is quite suboptimal from a hypertrophy perspective. And this is because when you're training your grip strength, you're mainly training the anterior compartment of your forearm, which is specifically only one of the 3 main portions of your forearm. In other words, if you're only relying on training your grip strength, you're essentially only training 1/3 of the forearm. But that is not the only issue I have with solely relying on grip strength training for your overall forearms growth, because while training your grip is technically going to be resistance training for the anterior compartment of the forearms, it is technically speaking an isometric exercise, which is inferior to isotonic exercises that involve contracting the muscle through a range of motion. And to use another muscle group as an example, this is why ab exercises such as leg raises are superior to, let's say, relying on a plank for overall ab growth. Because on a leg raise, you have an active range of motion where you're contracting the abs through spinal flexion and then stretching them through spinal extension, compared to a plank where you're just pretty much contracting the ab in place under load. And in the case of the forearms, when you're training for grip strength, you're contracting the anterior compartment of your forearms by holding the load in place, similar to how your abs contract on a plank. However, if you're trying to maximize forearms growth in the anterior compartment, ideally you want to be training wrist flexion, which is simply the act of flexing your wrist forward. As you see here, I'm getting a range of motion. We're actually contracting and changing the length of the muscle. And the good news is that there are numerous ways to actually do a wrist curl where you're training wrist flexion, in some cases using the same equipment you probably would be using with training your grip, such as dumbbells or barbells. You probably just have to lighten the load a little bit. Let's move on to tip number 2. Now, tip number 2 is to train all 3 important divisions of the forearms. Now, I alluded to you earlier that there are 3 main compartments of the forearms. There's going to be the anterior compartment, which is responsible for wrist flexion as well as finger flexion, but the main way we train the anterior compartment is through wrist flexion. Now, the second portion of the forearm is going to be the posterior portion of the forearms, which is responsible for wrist extension as well as finger extension. Now, the main way we're going to be training the posterior portion of the forearm is going to be through wrist extension, bringing your wrist back. Now lastly, and in my opinion, the most important portion of the forearm to train, especially if you only have time to train one of them, is the brachioradialis, which is this muscle up here. Now the brachioradialis is responsible for elbow flexion, the same function as the biceps and the brachialis. And no, that is not a mistake. The brachioradialis muscle, which is this part over here, should not be confused with the brachialis muscle, which sits underneath the biceps. Okay, so now that we understand the 3 portions of the forearms, let me give you my favorite exercises for each of the 3. Now for the anterior compartment of the forearms, I recommend a pronated, arm-supported cable wrist curl. So you've probably seen me do the pronated wrist curl like this, which is not bad. However, we can be a little bit more stable here. So what I like to do is I set the cable down a little bit, and what I'm gonna do is rest my upper arm on the cable itself and lean forward. In this position, I allow my wrist to go into extension in order to stretch the anterior compartment of the forearms, and then I simply curl my wrist forward. This is a very stable and very comfortable way to actually do a wrist curl, because in my opinion, if you're gonna do a supinated wrist curl with dumbbells, it kind of hurts your wrist a little bit to stay in the supinate position, especially under load. And moving on to the posterior compartment of the forearms, where you stay at the cable, and we're gonna perform a cable wrist extension. Now, the very common way is to basically hold this bicep curl and just extend your wrist back this way. But in my opinion, it's not really the most comfortable way to do it, and it's not gonna be the most stable because your biceps can become a limiting factor. So what I recommend is we're gonna perform a face-away cable wrist extensor. So what I did was raise the cable higher, but you want it low enough so that you can actually clear your balls. And what we're gonna do is take a step forward to unrack and start with your wrist into flexion. Now from here, we're gonna strain our wrist and try to go into extension. Now as you see, my legs are able to catch the bar as it comes down back into the stretch position, which makes the exercise much more stable compared to trying to hold that curl like this. And of course, the more stable an exercise is, the better we're able to recruit those muscle fibers that we're trying to train, and the closer we likely can train to failure. Let's move on to the third exercise. Now when it comes to the brachioradialis, you actually have a couple options. You can either do some sort of hammer curl, or you can do some sort of a reverse curl. Now, technically speaking, the further you get away from supination, which is gonna be more bicep biasing, the more you start biasing the brachialis slash brachioradialis. But how do you bias the brachioradialis over the brachialis? Now that's a little bit more of a contentious topic. Some claim that a hammer curl is gonna be more brachioradialis, while others claim that a reverse curl is gonna be more brachioradialis. Now in my opinion, I would prefer the default to a hammer curl because your grip is gonna be less of a limiting factor. Meaning with that, you can do some sort of dumbbell hammer curl, you can do it on cables, it's really up to you. However, let's say you wanna do a reverse curl. Well, let me show you exactly what variation I would do. Now, lastly, I know we can do a reverse curl in many ways, but in my opinion, the most stable way to do a reverse curl is on a seated cable row machine. And this is exactly how you do it. So what we're gonna do is attach a D handle on its cable row, come all the way to the back and sit on the ground. What we're trying to do here is rest our elbow on the back of the seat of the cable row. And from here, you can do a reverse curl while pretty much having these shoulder joints stabilized, so you can purely focus on that elbow flexion. I know this looks pretty extra, but I would tell you the reverse curl has a whole lot of limiting factors. But wait a sec, guys. What's that? What can we possibly use this for? Well, if we ditch the D handle, attach a cable cuff onto the seated cable row instead, now we're able to take our grip out of the movement completely. Because I know everyone who's tried a reverse curl has probably noticed that your grip tends to be a limiting factor, meaning you tend to lose your grip before your brachioradialis actually fatigues. But this way, if we combine the seated cable row setup with using a cable cuff, this is probably going to be the most optimal way to actually do a reverse curl without any limiting factors. And if you haven't tried this, you probably don't really know what it actually feels like to truly bring the brachioradialis to failure. So don't knock this. Maybe go to the gym at like midnight when no one's watching you. But not gonna lie, guys, this exercise is actually crap. Now move on to the last tip and quite possibly the most controversial one. And that is not everyone needs to directly train their forearms. Now I know that sounds hypocritical to pretty much everything I've said in this video, but I'm trying to be as universally helpful to everyone. And to be quite frank, not everyone needs to maximize forearms growth. Because you see, forearms are a little bit like the abs. Losing body fat, meaning getting to a low enough body fat percentage, is probably gonna be the biggest needle to move in order to have your forearms be overall more aesthetic. On top of that, maybe the indirect work you get from bicep exercises, back exercises, deadlifts, that sort of thing, is enough for the forearms to respond to the degree that you want them to. Again, not everyone wants to absolutely maximize forearms growth. Now, obviously, that's not gonna be nowhere as optimal for forearms growth as training all three compartments directly. So I guess the bigger question you should figure out is, which camp do I fall in? Do I naturally have smaller forearms? Am I lean? Or do I have really good genetics for forearms and I don't really even need to train them? Now, me personally, I've directly trained my forearms before. However, I'm not currently doing so right now. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be training them, because you have to also consider that I've been training for 10 years consistently. All I'm trying to say is that we all probably have a finite amount of resources and time to dedicate to working out. So if you're an absolute beginner and you're still trying to lose body fat, maybe you're currently trying to learn different movements, let's say you're trying to optimize your bench press form, you're trying to improve your leg days, you're just trying to learn the fundamentals, then I'd probably put forearm training overall at a pretty low priority in your overall training. So if you want my practical recommendation, here is what I recommend at 3 different experience levels. Now, first off, if you're a beginner that care enough to watch this video, I recommend incorporating some sort of hammer curl in your overall routine that would directly train the brachioradialis. On top of that, you will get some indirect work for the anterior compartment of the forearms as you progress on your back exercises, biceps, deadlifts, that sort of thing. Because you're still a beginner, you're probably gonna be able to respond to a relatively speaking suboptimal stimulus. On top of that, if you're currently at a higher body fat percentage than you want, then focusing on dieting and getting that body fat percentage lower is also gonna be hugely beneficial to the overall aesthetics of your forearm. Now moving on, if you're an intermediate lifter and you've been lifting for a couple years and you still want bigger or more aesthetic forearms, then for one thing, keep the hammer curl volume and consider perhaps even training hammer curls twice per week, or consider flipping between hammer curls and that reverse curl variation I showed you earlier. On top of that, consider getting some direct work for the anterior compartment, such as with that pronated cable wrist curl, as well as one exercise for the posterior compartment, such as that wrist extension exercise I showed y'all. On top of that, if you're currently still at a higher body fat percentage, let's say somewhere above 20%, I also still would recommend that you lower your body fat percentage. And the good news is that generally your forearms are a pretty lean area as is, meaning it should be one of the first parts of your body that you notice visibly actually get leaner. But honestly, overall, just being at a lower body fat percentage does wonders to your overall aesthetics. Now lastly, if you're an advanced lifter and you want to maximize forearms growth, well, in that case, I definitely recommend incorporating at least 10 sets of forearm exercise for each compartment across the week, and ideally spreading that volume across 2 different training sessions, meaning you're training each compartment of the forearms at least twice per week. And if you've hit a plateau on your forearm strength progress, then I'd even consider taking those forearm exercises and moving it to the beginning of your workout, where fatigue is less likely to be an issue, so you can have an easier time progressing. Now personally, do I think it's weird to prioritize your forearm training to that degree? Yes, but you know, if you're an advanced lifter and you really want to maximize forearms, like, I get it. I'm just telling you how I do it. And of course, aim to get down to 15% body fat, if not lower than that. Now it's gonna vary from individual to individual on what your fat distribution looks like, but again, just getting lean in general will do wonders to your overall physique. I reiterate this multiple times and in numerous videos, it really is that important. Now with that said, if you're looking for more overall guidance on getting to your fitness goals and basically how to structure your workout plans, not just prioritizing your forearms, but other muscle groups as well, then I highly recommend you apply my exclusive one-on-one fitness coaching program, where I do just that. I'm gonna pop some transformations on screen. So if you're interested, you can apply in the link in the description. But with that said, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Comment down below which of these forearm exercises you're gonna incorporate in your video, and especially let me know if you like that reverse curl variation I showed y'all. Hit subscribe to Level Up Your Physique, hit the like button to support my page, and hit the bell notification to get these videos right as they come out, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.